like to welcome you to the SCORE Business Showcase. We have another fantastic guest with us today. His name is Jim Dennison.
Hey, Steve.
And also his lovely wife, Becky. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Jim is in the surveyor. He is a surveyor. Now, what does a surveyor actually do, Jim?
Okay. Well, what we do is we measure and map out and mark out land that people own. We can also horizontally as well as vertically if topography is in question, or you need to know exactly where your boundaries are, or you need maps for permits.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I guess if you're buying a house, you want to make sure you're on the right property, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Now, what are the different types of land surveys?
Well, there are numerous types of surveys. The three that I specialize in, one is what's known as a zoning location survey, which you would get if you were going to add on to your home or build a new home on a piece of property. All towns have certain requirements that need to be met. So in order for them to make sure you're complying with it, you need to hire a surveyor who will then create a map that depicts the house, the driveway, the sheds, anything that's been built on the property, and how it complies with that town's particular zoning requirements, and then whatever you're going to do to make sure that it falls within those same requirements as well. Mm-hmm. There is also what's known as a boundary stakeout survey, where you need to know where your property lines are so that if you put up a fence, if you plant some bushes, you plant some trees, you do some landscaping, that you do it all within your boundary, so your neighbor doesn't get upset and make you remove a fence that you spend a lot of money on. So you want to make sure everything's within your property. The third type is that I generally do is what's known as an elevation certificate, which people who live near the water that's prone to flooding would need to have.
So over the last few years, we've gotten a lot of calls for elevation certificates with FEMA changing flood zones, and a lot of people having to renew insurance for flood insurance, especially with the storms that we've had over the last couple of years that have done a lot of damage.
Yes. Well, I'm sure they're going to have that going on down south.
Absolutely.
Up now,
yes.
With the name of what's the name of the hurricane?
Florence.
Florence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Matter of fact, I know a person by the name of Florence. So I'm going to have to call them up and say, now you named a hurricane after you.
There you go.
Now, how much does a survey cost?
That's an interesting question because it can vary. There are many factors that come into play. Sometimes it's the size of the lot, and unfortunately, if people have a small lot, they think it's going to be a lot less expensive. And sometimes the smaller lots are just as difficult, if not more difficult, to pin down where they actually exist. The terrain comes into play, the time of year, the amount of information available, whether physically on the ground already where property corners may be, or how descriptive or non-descriptive your deed is. So there are many factors that come into play as to what generates the cost of a survey. And when a client sees me out there working on their property, they're probably only seeing about a quarter to a third of the actual work that goes into it. It does surprise people a lot when I can give them a price, because it can range from maybe $1,000 to several $1,000s, depending on what's involved.
And the lots could be the same size. One lot, the same size as another, they could be totally different costs depending on what information we find. I get a lot of calls for that, and a lot of people are surprised when we give them a quote, but there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes into coming up with the actual survey. My job was prior to do a lot of research first. We have somebody who does our research now, but we would go to town hall, get everybody's deeds, neighboring properties' deeds, research all those, research map references, and look in places in town hall that there might be other maps hiding, and so a lot of work goes behind the scenes. A lot of field work goes behind the scenes. It's not just putting iron pins in your ground to locate your corner. So they tend to be a little surprised when they find out the cost, but it's a legal document, legal information that we're coming up with in the end. And so the cost is a little bit more than expected, but you find out what you've paid for.
Right.
You know, you've purchased this piece of land, and you want to know what you bought, and that's the way to do it.
Now, it seems like this is a family business, correct?
It is, yeah.
And how long have you all been married?
Going on 25 years.
All right, well, that's good. All right, and how long have you been in business?
I've been doing work part-time since 1997. However, in 2017, I totally went on my own with the help with Becky.
Started out in the field with him,
yes,
working in the field
really?
and doing office work, but as we started turning things over to completely on our own, I had to pick one or the other, so I stuck with the office, and he has a fellow who helps him part-time in the field.
Fantastic, good. So you guys work well together then.
Yeah.
So far, so good. Yeah.
Well, keep that up. All right. So it can be done out there. Now, what is an elevation certificate?
Okay. Well, people who live near the water that's subject to flooding, it could be a stream, it could be a river, the ocean. If FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association,
Tongue-tied.
yeah, tongue-tied, determines that your property may flood, your insurance company is going to charge you a rate. Now, without an elevation certificate, they don't have much to go on. So they could charge you more than what is maybe necessary. So what an elevation certificate is, it's a form that determines and tells the insurance company how high above sea level your home is, and where each floor of the house is, where the furnace is, and the utilities that make up the house, and how that relates to what FEMA says it'll flood to. Based on the probability of it getting to that height, then your insurance company can set a rate. So an elevation certificate will help them determine your risk of flooding.
Okay.
And like I said, we've been getting a lot of calls for that, and a lot of people have been finding that while the mapping, FEMA's mapping says they might be in a flood zone, sometimes they're not. Sometimes their elevation is actually higher than the flood zone, and they find that they've been paying insurance for a number of years when they didn't need to be. And so it's very helpful. If you think you may be higher than FEMA says you are, it's very helpful for you to get an elevation certificate done in that condition, especially when rates are increasing tremendously. Insurance companies have recently been increasing their rates for flood insurance, and people are paying anywhere up to $5,000 and $6,000 a year just for flood insurance.
Now, what causes a person to actually get into or what are the parameters, I should say, for being in the flood zone? Is there an elevation situation?
Exactly. If you live down the coast, like here in Stratford, a lot of FEMA says it'll flood to, in some areas, say 10 feet above sea level. And a lot of people they enjoy living by the water. So they build very close to the water, so you get the enjoyment of the water. However, it comes with the risk that you have the potential of flooding.
Right.
And so that love of the water is what gets a lot of people in trouble, unfortunately.
So yeah, FEMA sets those standards.
Yeah.
FEMA determines what they think you'll flood to.
Well, it seams like Milford is in that zone.
Oh, absolutely.
Constantly.
Exactly, yep.
Matter of fact, I think it was when Sandy hit. We went out to that area, and we saw actually the house, half the house was in the water, half the house was on the land. There was a lot of devastation at that period of time. Even at Seaside Park, I was amazed at what happened out there.
It's sad what it can do.
Now, so it's important to have you guys around because people can at least prepare for that situation.
And when they are in the flood zone, there are some things that they can do to help with insurance. You know, they can raise certain utilities out of that level to the first floor of their house if they're in the basement. And so there's certain things that they can do to, once they find out, you know, where they are in reference to that flood zone, to decrease the rate of their insurance.
Yes, matter of fact, I saw that when it came out to the Silver Sands area, right? A lot of the houses had elevated themselves
Yes.
in preparation for a flood. Now, what is a letter of map amendment?
Okay. Well, that's when, and like I had mentioned before, we come out and we find out that you are actually higher, the ground around your home is actually higher than what FEMA says it would flood to. Again, we use it, you know, FEMA says it'll flood to elevation 10. We come out and we find you're at 10.5 feet. So we prepare what's known as a letter of map amendment, which lists what FEMA says you would flood to compared to what you actually are. Prepare the paperwork, submit it to FEMA, and then FEMA removes you from being required to have flood insurance. That's up to you whether or not you want to not have it, but because you're close, but at least you're not required anymore to have flood insurance.
The mortgage companies will require you if they
Yes.
see that you're in that flood zone.
Exactly. Now, what is the 100-year flood?
Okay.
deal?
Well, that's and that's the basis for what FEMA says. Okay, it has the 100-year flood is that chance that it'll come up to your house, say at elevation 10. And the biggest, unfortunately, it's almost a misnomer calling it a 100-year flood because some people might think, okay, it flooded to that elevation last year. We're good for another 99 years. And unfortunately, that's not the case. It's actually a 1% chance every year that it can flood to that elevation.
Okay.
So it could happen every year. It could happen. It could even happen multiple times a year. It's only it's a probability of 1% every year happening.
Okay. Interesting. Now, I remember the largest flood that happened in this year, I think it was in 1955, when it took place here in Stratford. And actually, during Sandy, too, it was kind of flooding down at this lower end.
Oh, yeah.
So they had some challenges, right, even at that point. Now, what is adverse possession?
Okay. Well, adverse possession is when someone is occupying land that's not theirs, either by a fence or some other means that they're using your property. If they do it, if they meet certain conditions, if they do it knowingly, they exclude you from the property and have full use of it. And in the state of Connecticut, it has to be at least 15 years. They could actually acquire that property as theirs, even though it wasn't part of their deed. Or so it's something to look out for if you feel somebody is using your property. That's part of why it's important to have your property surveyed, to make sure that nobody else is using it on you, and you may end up losing it.
So when would be a good time for a person to get a survey?
Prior to buying a home would be a good time. Or even if you're selling a home, to make sure that there's the people buying it can have assurance that what you're looking at is actually what you are buying. So if you're purchasing a home and you question where a fence line is, or a tree line, or even a garden that somebody's using and occupying, and it's a good idea to have a survey done to make sure. It's interesting. You go out in search of a new home, you fall in love with the home, and you want to purchase this home, but what you're signing on the deed is a description of the land. It doesn't describe the house; it describes the land in which you're purchasing, and that's really what you have to be careful of. That and in most cases everything is what it's supposed to be, but I've seen enough bad stories where it's people have lost property or it's not what they think it is, unfortunately.
Wow.
Even times when people they look at a home and they see that this works for us, we can put an addition on the back for whatever purpose, or we can build a garage later. They down the road they purchase the house, and down the road they find out that town requirements won't allow them to do those. They might have enough space, but there's setback requirements. How close to the property line can you build?
Okay. Yes.
How big of a house can you have on that property? And they don't find that out until after the fact, and then they can't do what they had hoped.
And that would be disappointing
Absolutely, absolutely.
for the homeowner. Now, it seems like you're having fun at what you do. How does a person become a surveyor?
Oh, there's a couple of different ways. You can go to college for it. It's a 4-year degree, and then there's also, after that, you have to be in the business and involved in the day-to-day decision-making process, determining the boundaries where people, what they own. It's known as the boundary determinations. Or the way I did it was I just started off right out of high school. I had my guidance counselor pointed me in the direction of a survey company that needed help. I had no idea what it was, but I interviewed and got the job. I got to work outside, and I thought that was great. But as the years went by, I enjoyed what I was doing, and I learned about it. And again, it's the same requirements that you need to have a certain amount of time in the field. That's an apprenticeship, basically, is what it is. So that route takes 9 years versus a college, and then the other 3 years in the decision-making process of 7 years. So it's a lengthy process of getting licensed, and then you have to take a test for the state of Connecticut. Each state has its own testing requirements, and so I became licensed in 1997. I started in the field in '83, but it is something I thoroughly enjoy doing.
Now, is there any continuing education requirements?
Not requirements in the state. In Connecticut, they don't have requirements for doing it, but there is continuing education that I take advantage of. Sometimes a couple times a year, sometimes several times a year. There are different classes, and it's usually has to do with keeping up with the law of land surveying and what governs and how we make our decisions, which is, to me, is the most interesting part of it. The math is math. That doesn't change. It's the application of law that changes, and I find that thoroughly enjoyable.
Now, how do you stand out from your competition? My question is also is how many surveyors are there in the state approximately? Do you know?
Ooh.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot in the state.
Because I see them on the throughway.
Locally, there's a few. We actually have to be good friends with a number of other surveyors that we've known for many years, aside from surveying. But I think as far as standing out, we're a very small company. We're able to focus more on private homeowners, is what residential surveys is more of what we do. Okay. We can give more attention to that. You call for a quote, I'll answer the phone. You don't have to go through some messaging system. I think being a small knit business makes us stand out.
So it sounds like you have a personal touch. Right,
a little bit. I'd like to think so.
That's what we aim for, because I tend to be more on the technical side, and I'll explain things very,
I try not to let him talk to people.
Whereas she understands more from the homeowner's perspective, the layman's perspective, and can explain it that way much better than I can. I will bore you with the details of the exact sciences behind it, whereas she can communicate better as far as a homeowner.
Now, how do you get your measurements? When I used to work for the water company, we used to pace off, 1 foot at a time. As far as that's concerned. What do you guys do?
Well, we have an electronic total station, or a transit is more commonly known as, and it measures distances using light and reflective prisms.
It's the thing that a lot of people think looks like a camera that's
Yes.
sitting on top of a tripod.
Yep.
It does not take pictures, though.
Okay.
And we take angles and measurements with that, and then it all comes back into the office, and I put it in on my computer. I transfer it all to my computer, and I compare it then to all the deeds and maps, what they have to say. You know, a lot of guys are using, you know, some people, you know, they always ask, you know, you're using GPS,
Right.
because they think that's the benchmark of the best to use. Well, unfortunately, you know, GPS is a very powerful and useful tool, but as with any tool, it has its applications. So we don't personally use it because it's on a small residential lots. It's a little bit of overkill, considering its cost versus what I'm doing. You have to worry about it's an antenna that's receiving signals from satellites. So
Gotcha.
if you're next to a building, if you're under tree cover, it has its limitations. So while it's a very useful and powerful tool, we use you know, more of
It's just overkill for
yeah,
us,
yeah.
for doing small residential.
traditional ways to measure.
I've seen gizmos that, like, I think some of them maybe use like infrared. You ever use any of that information?
I use, like, sometimes, like, for interior, if I'm doing elevation certificates, we have to measure interior basements, and so we use for that purpose.
Right.
Yep.
Cool. Now, well, I think we answered this question. How big is your company?
3 of us.
2.5. 2 full-time, 1 half part-time.
Now, you know, right now we're transitioning from summer to the fall. Do you guys actually work in the wintertime?
Yep, we work all year round. You know, we get that a lot, but people don't think, you know, it's too cold outside, you can't go outside. It's like, I wish that were true, but
It is slow season. Winter
yeah.
is slow season. The end of summer is a little bit slow too, because I think people getting their kids ready to go back to school.
Yes.
They've done a lot of their yard work already for the season, figuring out, oh, I think we need a fence. You know, they're kind of done with that going into fall. So it gets a little slow around the end of summer and a little bit in winter. But
yeah,
we do work year round.
Yeah, the only thing that keeps me in is if it's actually inclement weather, it's raining, it's snowing, extremely windy days where I got to worry about branches falling on me. So other than that though, I'm outdoors.
Now, what has been some of your challenges? Right, in
I would
business?
say bees. He got stung. He got stung yesterday twice. Those are definitely a challenge for him.
They are a challenge. And just, I think, you know, I love surveying. Running a business is a challenge. Fortunately, Becky handles a lot of that, and being able to help me with that, help the company with that. So I think that's probably been one of our biggest challenges, is just getting the business side of it down.
Yeah, making sure we're doing everything, you know, by the book. Little things that you don't know, types of insurance that we need to carry, or little things. Making sure all that stuff is in place. It was a bit of a challenge at first, since it was really new to me.
Right, right. That's good. Now, how about what are some of your successes, or your biggest success you've had?
I think it's the fact that we've actually got the business off the ground and are going with it, and it's to work with my wife, I think, is a big success. You know, we enjoy being with each other. We enjoy doing things together. It's just one more aspect that we get to do one more thing together. It's a family business. It's enjoyable. I'm not looking, you know, to grow into anything huge. I just enjoy what I do, and I enjoy who I do it with.
So that brings up a question. How far is your reach? Do you cover the state of Connecticut, New York?
Within Connecticut, but generally within Fairfield and New Haven counties.
Okay.
Is where I work. Other than that, it just gets a little too far to make it worthwhile.
And who is your target market?
Homeowners. They're our primary target. They, for like I said, you know, needing to know where their boundaries are, needing to know, you know, a map for to get a building permit. I think they're the best to work for. You start getting into larger developments, you get larger headaches. So I like to keep it small. So the individual homeowner is my target client.
And are you allowed to go to or on other people's property when you're doing this?
The short answer is yes. I, however, will try to talk to any neighbors. If on your back corner, I suspect there might be a property marker I'd want to get to. Mm-hmm. It's in your best interest as well for me to use that as a measurement to help determine where your neighbor's boundary are, and by default, your other boundary is. Mm-hmm. So I will try to involve the adjoining homeowners as much as possible, because it is necessary for me to go beyond the target property. Almost the entire block is part of the puzzle that I have to put together in order to come up with your boundary lines.
Now, how can people get in touch with you, Jeff?
Well, either through my website, they can get it's my phone number, email, mm-hmm. and as Becky said before, we're either one of us is going to pick up the phone or respond to your email.
And what is your website address?
It's jadsurveyor.com.
And your phone number?
It's 203-377-2091.
All right, fantastic. Now, one of the things that we suggest is books, and one of the, if I knows this book is worn. We've been using it.
It's been well read.
Right. But the name of it is Think and Grow Rich. And this here, it provides, it's just like, I'm sure, Becky, you made a cake. Right? And if you ever miss an ingredient, that cake's not going to come out well. So the same thing with business. All right, there's certain ingredients that you need, and there's about 18 of them that this book discusses. And if you use several of them, using it together, you'll have success in your business. Mm-hmm. And the big issue here.